the introduction and for the invitation to give this seminar. So my talk today will be less about the applications in biology, but rather about the methods that we develop, usually motivated by biology. And my background is in computer science and specifically in formal logic. So I will talk a lot about logic today and how it relates to artificial intelligence, and in particular, some of the modern machine learning models. So in general, just as a brief introduction, so logic is one of the main foundations of artificial intelligence because we want our knowledge of the world to affect decisions. And the point is that this knowledge is not something that we just want to retrieve from it. Are symbol systems or physical symbol systems. I give one example. So this proposition that based on which we want to perform an action that we want the world to satisfy may not be explicitly represented. It may not be something that we have in our database. So we need means for symbol manipulation. So a very basic example is if we know that a patient is allergic to a medication, M, and we also know that anybody who is allergic to M is also allergic to M dash, then we can ask the question whether it's safe to prescribe this medication to this patient X. And of course, we know that it's not safe to prescribe this medication if the patient is allergic, but there's nothing in our knowledge base that tells us. So we need ways to reason over our knowledge base in order to test whether whether the world satisfies a certain proposition on which we want to base an action. And for this, we go back quite a long time in AI history to the physical symbol system hypothesis proposed by Newell and Simon, where physical symbol systems or this hypothesis states that physical symbol systems have the necessary and sufficient means for general intelligent action, and therefore form the foundation of artificial intelligence. And the main implementations of physical symbol systems that we apply in computer science are based on mathematical logic or similar formal systems, which we can describe or characterize using mathematical logic. And my talk is going to be specifically about one type of these representation languages mainly, but I need to introduce them as well. I will talk about ontologies. Ontologies are particular structures. So there's a term which comes from philosophy where ontology as a discipline studies the nature of existence and the categories of being. It goes back to Aristotle. But it entered computer science in about early 90s, where ontologies in computer science were defined famously by Gruber as explicit specification of a conceptualization of a domain. And there is a brief representation of an ontology about plants. Just below what we can see in this ontology, there are classes, and these classes may have some labels and some descriptions. And there are axioms that relate classes to each other. The axioms here are indicated by edges between the nodes. So nodes represent classes, and the edges represent axioms between them. So there are two types of axioms. One is a subclass axiom, for example, between the septum and the plant structure, and another one is something that we'll have to analyze a bit closer, but it's essentially an existential restriction, so that every ovary septum must be part of some gynoecium in a plant. And the language that we use in order to, or just let me summarize this briefly. So ontologies are a way in which we can provide standard identifiers across different databases, and this is the main application that ontologies are being used. in databases in life sciences and in other types of databases, including Wikipedia. So we can use them to integrate data by reusing these standard identifiers. They contain terms. So this is a vocabulary within a domain and some definitions. They're usually for human understanding. And they also contain axioms. And these axioms take the form of expressions in a formal language. And most of this talk will be about these axioms. And I will talk about one language to express these axioms, which is part of the semantic web and on which most of this presentation and most of the methods that we have built is based, because it's so widely used, especially in biology, but also in other areas where knowledge has to be represented formally. And this language is based on description logic. So this is a standard definition of just the semantics of a description logic language. So essentially we have unary predicates, or we call them concepts. This is A, and this is the standard definition of the semantics of a first order language. So we have our interpretation, which consists of a domain and an interpretation function. Then named concepts or concept names are interpreted basically as subsets of the domain. Relations are tuples or subsets of tuples of the domain. And then in a very standard way, this language will allow us to extend interpretations inductively. And this is just below with 5 of the concept constructors. So we have the intersection, union, negation, universal and existential quantification. And the reason I introduced this, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I need a little bit of the semantics later on. So this is just a basic overview of the semantics of this particular form of description logic. And I was talking about OWL ontologies, and OWL is a language. It's the web ontology language, which is part of the semantic web, and it's based on description logics. So it's based on a particular type of description logic, not ALC, but it's called SROIC. And this is a language which is ALC with a lot of other additional constructors. So there are complex role inclusions, role hierarchies, transitive roles, nominals, different types of quantifiers that express cardinality, and also some data type properties. And so this much for the introduction. The key question that I would like to address in this talk is, how do we combine logic? And here I talk about this particular type of logic, and this is the web ontology language or description logics, or this particular type of description logic underlying the web ontology language with machine learning models. And I express this here. I use this slide because it shows both the areas of application that I'm interested in and the basic methods. So let's start with the left-hand side of this figure, where we have different types of symbol systems, which we express generally using description logic-based language or the web ontology language, as just shown. So these are symbolic systems, and the key property of a symbol system or of symbolic representation is that we can interpret the expressions written in them. And so we can both write or read from symbols, and it gives us something that is meaningful to us, because symbols stand for something else that we can interpret. And within this symbol system, we perform generally reasoning, which means we perform deductive inference. And on the right-hand side of this figure, you can see different types of unstructured data. And unstructured data are things that we usually measure. We can represent this mathematically as big matrices or in particular other types of formats. And this is where we often, where we usually apply some pattern recognition methods or machine learning methods in order to characterize certain types of patterns that we can identify, and we relate them to an outcome. And the key point are the two arrows in between. The two arrows in between is, there are twofolds. From the left to the right, it's the embedding direction. It's where we want to take symbolic knowledge, so knowledge that we have about our domain, and embed it in the same space as our data, so that we can combine it with our data for machine learning. And this is how we would introduce background knowledge in a machine learning model, if we can embed our knowledge appropriately in the same space as our data. And the second direction is the extraction direction, is where we can formulate the outcomes or the decision of a machine learning model symbolically, so that we can reason over it and determine the consistency of this prediction with what we know to be true in our domain. And you also see the areas of application in bioinformatics, but I'm not going to talk much about these areas of application, but usually on the right-hand side is what we can measure, for example, about some patient or about a plant. So we would measure gene expression, we would measure, sequence the organism. So it's something where we get large amounts of unstructured data. And on the left-hand side of this figure, you can see what we want to infer about this. So we want to know how a genotype relates to a phenotype. We want to understand how the protein sequence relates to its function, or how gene expression relates to a disease. So the left-hand side is usually very informative, not only in biomedicine, but in particular there. And on the right-hand side is what we can observe or what we can obtain. So I will talk about mainly the first part, the embedding part here. So the question is, what do we mean specifically when we talk about an embedding? And embedding symbolic knowledge or knowledge from a symbol system within a space where we represent our data. So an embedding is generally, and I like to give this definition of an embedding first. I know that many of you will be very familiar with the concept, but I like to give this definition because it makes two things clear. So I take an embedding as a morphism from one mathematical structure X into another structure Y, such that X is preserved in Y, maybe under some particular operations in Y. It forces us, or at least this definition forces us, to make explicit what the structure X is, what the structure Y is, and what do we mean by being preserved, or that X is preserved in Y, and under which operations X is preserved under Y, in order to call something an embedding. So the main aim of this embedding is, of course, that we want some operations that are very difficult in X to perform, but which are much easier in Y. So this is why we would want to embed one structure into another structure. So simple things that we want to perform in Y is, for example, compute similarity. So similarity is something quite challenging to compute between symbolic representations, but quite easy to do, for example, in certain vector spaces. We may also want to apply gradient-based optimization or gradient descent, which requires our representation to be differentiable, and at least partially, and something that is not a property of symbol structures, so it makes no sense to call them differential. So in general, what we are aiming for here is to take a formalized knowledge base, and we want to embed it in the Rn in a particular way that we preserve some structures or some properties of the knowledge base within the Rn. And I'll talk about three approaches. I'll talk about the first two rather briefly, mainly for historic reasons. And the third one I will talk about a bit more elaborately, because this is something that we find quite promising recently. So I'd start with graph-based approaches. We can take a knowledge base and somehow represent it as a graph. And this is something that is maybe familiar to a lot of you, because many of you will be familiar with knowledge graphs. So a knowledge graph here, we take a knowledge graph, we can embed knowledge graphs. So this is a very basic approach. There are literally over 100 methods available to embed knowledge graphs these days. But you can find on the left-hand side a kind of knowledge graph where we have nodes which represent some entities in our domain. And then we have edges. They can be, they're usually directed, these edges. But of course, we can add the inverse between the different entities which express relations between them. The crucial point here is these two classes on the top. This is the Go classes. So Go classes would come from an ontology called the gene ontology. Just represent this here, and this symbol, this squared subset equal symbol, this is a subclass symbol in description logic syntax. So we can combine our data or our facts, our world knowledge, and our ontological knowledge in some forms in this graph-based representation. There are many ways in which we can do this, so it's not standardized. There's no unique way in which we can formalize or in which we can project a formal knowledge base into a graph, but there are many different approaches or several different approaches for this. So we can do this. But the key point here is that this dotted line. So this dotted line, so you see that FOXP2, this is a protein, has this function, this is this Go, it's a kind of behavior, it's language. So FOXP2 is a gene which is crucial for language in humans. And this is vocalization behavior. So FOXP2 has this function of vocalization behavior, which is a function of behavior. And based on these two axioms, we can infer deductively that FOXP2 must also have the function of behavior. This is this top Go class here. And we can either add or not add these inferred edges to this graph. So we can either deductively close this graph or we don't. We just assume that we represent our knowledge as it is expressed. And then we can embed this graph. One way to do this is, for example, by using some random walk-based approach where we have iterated random walks which generate some sentences, and those we can then embed through a language model. And the embeddings then we can use for different types of things. So we tried this in 2017 and on a graph which basically captures a lot of different types of information about genes and the diseases they're involved in and drugs which may target them. And you can see the prediction results. So this was quite nice. This paper was in bioinformatics, and each of these tasks, so we basically just formalized this, and each of these tasks represent essentially almost a subfield in bioinformatics. So there are hundreds of papers predicting drug targets and so on. So in most of our evaluation, we could match state-of-the-art performance of some of the best performing methods just by having this large scale knowledge-based approach. But it's not what I want to talk about. So you can see here in this evaluation table, so we do this without reasoning, so without computing this deductive closure and with computing this deductive closure. And you can see, so my hope was that exploiting the semantics of the language and applying this deductive closure would actually improve the performance because you would have access to more information. When you look at these results, there's almost no difference. Sometimes it's a little bit better, sometimes it's a little bit worse. So this clearly does not help. And the reason is that this random walk, of course, is completely agnostic to the semantics. What we really preserve is some kind of co-occurrence relationship of classes within axioms. And then we propagate this a bit through this graph, so to make it a bit more indirect. So this was an approach that somehow failed to capture the semantics of the language in a neural language model, although it showed some promising results. So then we moved on and we tried something new by exploiting the axioms directly. So we thought, okay, maybe this graph is a little bit ad hoc and we need to also find ways to generate this graph. We tried this also when then we looked at these axioms. Some of these axioms, they cannot easily be represented in a graph. They might include 3 classes, and then we need to have some kind of weird nodes or some artificial nodes which make them up, which link to 3 classes in different ways. So it's not so easy to generate this. So the question was, can we do this maybe directly? So we designed a method which was called first onto to vec and then OPA to vec. OPA to vec essentially treated just these axioms as a corpus of different statements syntactically. And then it also looked at all the metadata, so the labels and descriptions of the ontology classes. So this was at the very beginning. Ontologies have labels and something for humans. So we could put all of this in a second corpus. And then we apply this deductive closure and use some kind of pre-trained model from PubMed, just because we wanted to have these. So when you look on this pink part, this metadata, so you have posterolateral margin, we wanted these words to have some kind of meaning. So we use some pre-trained word-to-vec models, so these words actually have some meaning. So pre-trained on PubMed, this word-to-vec, and then we would embed them again using a language model. And when we looked at this, this was the first time that we actually could outperform some common benchmark. So I'm just going to talk. So this is a benchmark where we predict protein-protein interactions in human and yeast, just based on the functional similarity. So the functional similarity of the proteins. So the assumption is if the proteins, they have similar functions, then they're more likely to interact. And our baseline here, and this was the state of the art at the time, was Resnick's semantic similarity measures. So there are a couple of benchmarks. So at the bottom, 0.78 AUC in human and 0.79 in yeast. And what we did was without a reasoner, so this didn't work very well. We couldn't even beat our baseline. And then we tried just onto-to-vec, just the axioms with this word-to-vec model, couldn't beat our baselines. And then we tried applying a neural network to predict this in a supervised way. It's not directly comparable, but we still put it in here because it's so we basically had to subset this. We had to subset because we needed some protein-protein interactions to train on and then some to predict. So it's not exactly the same data set. But the results of Resnick are essentially identical for this. So then we did this in a supervised way where we could improve this, and then OP8-to-vec just using cosine similarity. So this is something I have to say. So if there's not an N with a neural network there, so it's not supervised, we just used cosine similarity. But just using text, even just using this language model with cosine similarity, we could improve over our baseline. And then using a neural network to train this worked very well. Now, the problem is, of course, with something like this, we didn't actually do something new. It seems like even a step back from what we did with random walks and some kind of graph embeddings, because we just have the axioms, and it's again a language model, so it doesn't actually care about any of the semantics. And there seems to have been no point in me showing you what the semantics of a description logic looks like if I just was going to talk about language models. So it's again just based on co-occurrence patterns, and here also with their deductive closure, but this is basically almost an almost trivial side effect. So let's try to think about, or let's try to look into what we tried to do more recently, and how to capture the semantics. So any of these word-based methods cannot actually capture the semantics. They only capture co-occurrence relations in the axioms. And the semantics relies on interpretations, or if you prefer, there are sigma algebras or universal algebras, which are the model structures of first-order logic theories, and description logic is a fragment, usually the two-variable fragment or a little bit more limited of first-order logic. So in order to capture the semantics, what we would need to do is to translate the syntax in this table here into the semantics. So I repeat this here. It's only a fragment. It's not even all of ALC. It's for a language called EL. It's a standardized part of the web ontology language called OWL2EL. It's one of the profiles. It has a number of properties. It's about the simplest language that we can use, the simplest description logic-based language for which we can generate these semantics. And it has only intersection and existential quantifier, no negation, no unrestricted negation, and no union. No universal quantifier either. But what we want to do is, we would want to generate a sigma structure, a model that satisfies all the generalized concept inclusions here, which means there must be an interpretation of C and D. So if C subclass D, then C the interpretation of C must be a subset of the interpretation of D. So our idea here is that if we have a knowledge base T with a signature, so signature is the set of symbols in our knowledge base, then we want to find an embedding in the Rn such that the image of this embedding function is a model of our theory. So this embedding should take the set of symbols in our signature and generate a model. If we can find an embedding of this type, then we have an embedding which actually captures the semantics. And the first question we have to answer is whether such models even exist. So if we can find a model in the Rn in all cases, but for at least the EL language, this tiny little description logic that I have just shown, we know that these are guaranteed to exist. So we know that every consistent EL theory has infinite models. And we know by the theorem of Löwenheim and Skolem in the upwards direction that if there's an infinite model, then also one in the Rn. So at least the existence of such models is guaranteed. Now the question is whether we can find such a model. So our idea was the following. We take relation symbols from our signature and concept symbols, and we define two functions, a function Fe and a function Re. So Fe is the general embedding of relations and concepts, and Re is part of the embedding, which will become clear shortly. And we define them in the following way, that we want that Fe applied to a concept and Re applied to a concept map to points in an n-ball, so an n-dimensional ball, with the aim that the interpretation of this concept is exactly all the points which lie within this n-ball. And the idea is that Fe maps to the center of the n-ball and Re maps to the radius of this n-ball, such that we can define the interpretation of a concept based on this set. So it's all those x which lie within this radius around the point defined by Fe. These will become the extensions of unary predicates or concept symbols in this language. The second is the embedding of the relations. And for relations, we reuse a property based on a knowledge graph embedding method called trans-E. But essentially, we take the interpretation of R to be all pairs of, so all tuples of points x and y, such that x plus the embedding of R equals y. So R is a vector, and then it's just a transformation, and any pair of points with such that x plus the embedding of R equals y is satisfied are the extension of R. And then all we have to do is use the axioms of our theory to find these two embedding functions. There are a few technical steps that I'll try to, I'm not trying to be boring, so I'll just try to outline what they are. So we can simplify this problem a little bit. We don't need an A box, so we can eliminate certain types of axioms. So just using these GCIs, general concept inclusions, is enough by rewriting role assertions and class assertions. And we can normalize our T box, and this is an old result. For this particular language, we can transform our whole ontology so that every statement takes the form of one of 7 normal forms. So the first one is C subclass D. C and D are concept names. So C and D here are concept names, and E is also a concept name. And this bottom symbol And this is the unsatisfiable concept. And you can see in the second type of normal form, we have the intersection C intersected D subclass D. And then we have a way to express basic disjointness between C and D. Basically, C and D, the intersection of C and D is empty. So we have 7 normal forms, and it will, and you'll see that the bottom symbol cannot appear in the 4th one, so it cannot appear on the right-hand side there. So we have these 7 normal forms, and then we basically define a loss for each of the normal forms, where we randomly initialize our embedding functions and then define a loss, add up all the losses and find them. So I'll give one example for these losses. So this is a loss for C subclass exists RD, so for one of the normal forms. And this loss, what it tries to achieve, it basically forces this n ball of C transformed by this vector R. So basically, intuitively, if you look at the last line, if you take the n ball of C, this is the interpretation of C transformed by R, so plus R, or plus the embedding of R needs to lie within the n ball of D. So this is what this loss function is trying to achieve. And then there is a margin and there's some regularization, which are pretty standard, so I'm not going to explain them too much. So margin is basically just for n balls, we can force them to be properly inside and so on. Okay, so we basically have this loss function. There are 4. There's one here. It doesn't show 2 of the other ones because they're very similar. And there's one which we can add, but we don't have to add this function on the top right, which is essentially a kind of negative sampling. We don't need to add this. In some cases, it improves our prediction performance. So we just write this here as well as a function. So let's have a look at what is happening when we optimize. So on the right-hand side, you can find a knowledge base, which is just a basic knowledge base about the family domain, some family relationships. And then on the left-hand side, on the top left, you can see how this optimization works. We visualize this every 5 epochs, and we output in 2-dimensional space how this works. So you can see the red circle. So it all starts randomly initialized. The red circle represents the male concept, the yellow circle, the person concept. And you'll see that the first axiom, male is a subclass of person. So you'll see how this optimization pushes this male concept or this male ball into the person ball. And the same thing happens for mother. It's just a little bit cluttered here for mother and for female as well. So you have father, which overlaps with male as well. So this is you'll see this tiny little concept. So there's a tiny little circle for father, which lies in person, and it lies in male. It moves around, so you have to watch it at the very beginning as well. And there's one crucial feature, and this is that we can prove a kind of soundness for this embedding. So we can prove that if our loss reduces to 0, and given some constraints on the margin parameter gamma, but if we achieve a loss of 0, then we can prove that our theory has a model. So this is something that is a very nice formal guarantee, which tells us that what we actually do, or what we are doing here, is we generate models which do capture some aspect of the semantics of our language. And we tested this also on this protein-protein interaction task. You can see that, so before we had with Ontologies and OPA we got like a 0.91 AUC, but here we do get even a substantial improvement with EL embeddings and with ELBA. We compared to a number of different graph embedding methods, so they perform much worse. Also Resnick similarity on this and some other similarity measures. So this is our EL embedding model. You'll see that it's not the best performing model because I took this table just from one of our latest preprints on ELBE, because there are a number of limitations of this and some things we have not achieved. Because the main limitations of this EL embeddings is, so there are a number of limitations that we still need to resolve. So the first one is that the intersection of two n-balls is not an n-ball, so intersection does not actually work. And for this, we can use axis parallel rectangles, so basically boxes instead of n-balls, because the intersection of two boxes is again a box as long as they are parallel to the axis. So this is our ELBE result, and you have seen that it also improves the performance, at least on this common benchmark. Our relation model is pretty primitive, so this trans-E model, it only allows one-to-one relations. It doesn't actually capture one-to-many relations, but there are many more complex relation models, but they all have some other problems. So ELBE includes one extension where it's basically just a multi-layered perceptron, the relations, but it's not something that is satisfactorily solved yet. The expressivity is still limited, so we have only done this for EL or EL++, so this tiny subset of languages, but it's the most common fragment of description logic or of OWL, which is used in biomedicine. So in some sense, it's good for us, but it's not yet there. There are some issues on the number of axioms in each normal form, but there's one crucial limitation, and this is the last result. And this is that so when you look at this soundness theorem, the soundness theorem sounds very nice, but it's of course satisfied if we can never reduce the loss to zero. So then this theorem holds true. So it might just be trivially true in all cases. And so it's not a very strong theorem. If we have this theorem and its inverse, so if T has a model, then we are able to reduce the loss to zero, maybe together with some other conditions. We call this completeness. Then we have a sound and complete embedding, but this is something that is still missing. We can actually prove that it's not possible to generate a geometric embedding based on either n-balls or on boxes for every ontology. So we know that it's not going to be complete now, but we have a number of ways in which we can extend this so that we can get closer to this completeness result now. There's one more thing I want to show you on what you can do with this, and this is zero-shot prediction. So zero-shot prediction, by this, I mean here we want to predict instances of a class, and we may not have a single training instance of this class. So for us, this is a case, and this is just an example from bioinformatics, but there are many other cases. We have no protein which has a particular function using our gene ontology or some other ontology. So no protein has ever been observed with a certain function, but we want to still predict if a new protein that we have found may have this function. And this is what we call zero-shot prediction. And we assume that we have a knowledge base or an ontology where we have some axioms, in particular that C is used as part of some axioms, because if we don't have some additional information about C, then still we can't predict. But if we have some additional information about C, and maybe not just intersection like A and B is equivalent to C, but it could be relational, or it could be some other type of information, could be very indirect. So we don't have training data, and we want to predict instances of C. And I have this very complex figure. We need to maybe make it more simple, but what we have done is, on the right-hand side, you see this EL embedding space, and it's still with spherical or ball embeddings. So we have this embedding space from EL embeddings, and on the left-hand side, we have a protein. So we take this protein and simply use some kind of embedding method to reduce or to embed this protein based on its sequence in the same space as our axioms. So the same space in which we have our classes that characterize functions of proteins. And then they become points in this space. And based on the relations between these classes, we can then infer or make inferences about protein P and the functions it may have. And we call this model DeepGo 0. So this is a zero-shot function prediction method with axioms from OWL ontologies, in particular EL ontologies here. So I'll have to come to a close if we want to have the discussion. So maybe we can look at this this method in detail, but I think it's pretty clear that if we have proteins P and we project them into the same space, then we can use the relational model and the relation between these n-balls to infer functions of P, even if we don't have any training data. And we tested this.
Robert, there's a network there, right? So you embed with a network. Do you train this network, pre-train this network?
So it's a joint optimization. So it has two components. So we jointly train the embedding model for protein P and for EL embeddings. So we have the axioms as an input. It goes through the standard loss functions for EL embeddings. Then we have the proteins. They become points in the same space. And the way the inference works is through has function relations. So the has function relations. So this is basically, there's this dotted class here, and then there is it's not a very clear figure. I'm sorry. But essentially this protein, what we are inferring is this protein is a subclass of things that have function C. So this is the function C, and then we have proteins which have this function C here. And then we can infer also whether it has function D based on the additional axiom here. If we have this kind of structure of that function, this D, or standing in relation R to D, is a subclass of E. But they're trained jointly.
Zero shotting, meaning that you use only one subject for training. Does that mean this?
What we mean by zero shot is that we do not have a single protein which has the function C. So we have never seen, so it's zero shot. So it's zero shot here for a particular class. We have proteins for other classes. So there are proteins, in this case, we may have proteins for D. We have proteins or with function E or other functions. And we have all the axioms, but we have never seen a protein which has this function C. So it's zero shot for the function C.
Thank you.
You can also do it for things like images. So you may have images for horses, images for striped things, and then you use these kind of axioms to infer zebras. So you know zebras are striped horses. Then you can use these kind of axioms and you will perform the inference within the model.
Sure, please carry on.
Yep. So I just show this performance here. So for zero-shot prediction, I think this is my last content slide. So on the left-hand side, you can see the performance of predicting functions just compared to a standard multilayer perceptron. So we just benchmark it against standard MLP. It worked. The MLP is close to state-of-the-art performance. You can see that we basically look at different buckets. They start at 1 because the MLP cannot make any predictions if it doesn't have training data. So this is a multi-class problem. And we measure the performance for each class based on the number of proteins that we have to train on this class. And you can see that there's quite a difference in AUC in the beginning of this, and then this multi-layer perceptron will catch up to this DeepGo 0 prediction. And then on the right-hand side, you see the zero-shot prediction performance for just a few of the classes, you see that some of the classes it doesn't work very well. Some of the classes it works almost perfectly, and it depends on the number and the type of axioms that are used to constrain the class. So if it has a lot of information, in particular, if it has an equivalence class axiom, it can very accurately predict zero shot, and otherwise it is more difficult to predict to do the zero shot prediction. Last thing, we also have a software library. So the software library, the GitHub link is at the bottom. It implements all the different methods that I talked about and a lot of other methods from other people and other groups, which are doing similar kind of work on machine learning with OWL ontologies. So the library is called MOWL. You can find it on GitHub. It's designed to be high performance, so it's bridging Python, and some algorithms are written in Scala, mainly because most of the work on ontologies require the JVM because they need access to the OWL API. So it needs to have this bridge between Java and Python. So if you are interested in these algorithms, it's not yet fully documented, so it's not, it doesn't have release 1 or something like this, but it has a lot of the algorithms. There is pretty good documentation for some of them still lack documentation. So this is something that still has to be added. But if you're interested, feel free to use it and give us some feedback or implement your own algorithms using MOWL. There are a lot of helper functions for this. So the next steps for this is to work towards more sound and complete embeddings, because we do want formal guarantees. We want the formal guarantees not only because it's beautiful to have these guarantees, but these guarantees would tell us that what we are doing is actually finding models, faithfully capturing the semantics, and this allows us to identify biases or explicitly remove biases from models to ensure some kind of fairness for these models, because we can encode them simply as constraints, and then we can also test them. So it's something that is quite important to have these, to have both soundness and completeness, at least for embedding axioms in machine learning models. So we have a number of different approaches that we are testing for this. I'm not going to go into this. So there are different approaches that we are pursuing, and there are other approaches by other groups. So in summary, I really like this quote by Feigenbaum, although it's an ancient quote and it was done in a completely different context. So this quote is that the domain-specific knowledge plays a critical role in organizing and constraining search, and that the theme is that in the knowledge is the power. And he wrote this, and it created this surge of expert systems in the 1970s and early 80s. And he used it for discrete search, so things like tree search or graph search. But what I would argue for is that the domain-specific knowledge now is almost as crucial or even more crucial than it was in the 50 years ago when Feigenbaum wrote this statement, only that the type of search that we are interested in has changed. We are no longer concerned, or we are no longer that interested in discrete search or search on discrete structures, but now we are searching continuous optimization, which is also a kind of search for a minimum. And we need to find good ways to embed and to encode the domain-specific knowledge in these optimization algorithms if we want to have machine learning methods that are fair and that generalize to relatively complex problems. And this is in particular useful for biology, but it's important in almost every domain in which we are going to apply machine learning models. And this is why we need to do more work, or this is why we are working on these areas, and in particular on the guarantees, on the formal guarantees and the formal side, soundness and completeness of these different methods. I would like to thank mainly my group and a lot of the people at KAUST who worked with me on these problems over the last 7.5 years at KAUST, and would like to thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry that I could not be there in person, and I want to end with this generated haiku, which was generated using an automated reasoner from the Uniprot knowledge base. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. Is there any questions from audience, please? If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask him. I'm probably gonna start with some questions. And you have one slide. Yeah, if you have any question, you can ask, you can interrupt me, and if you want to ask, right? Okay, so you have slides show this contour gradually expanding. Right? Is that the kind of algorithm like gradient descent or optimization you did try to minimize some loss function? Yeah, would you give us a little bit of details on this experiment?
Yes, absolutely. So what this is trying to do is to exactly find an interpretation for the knowledge base on the right. And we are using gradient descent in order to minimize, so the loss functions, we minimize these loss functions, or this is one part of the loss functions. We have one for all the 7 normal forms, and we just sum them up. So we jointly minimize them all. And what we are doing here is we find a model in 2-dimensional space, or we try to find a model in 2-dimensional space. And then we simply output the n balls after each 10 iterations. And then this is 99, 1,000 iterations of gradient. It's a gradient descent based optimization. So it's 1,000 iterations, and after 10 iterations, we output this and then just visualize it in a 2D space. So it's just a way for us to see what is happening.
Wait. Okay, would you please go back to the loss function slide?
Yes.
So is this differentiable? So I saw, absolute values, etc., etc. How do you run gradient descent, max, or you said these are all non-differentiable, right? So how do you run gradient descent on this loss function?
It's all differentiable because, so this is the loss function. It's essentially, so if we look at this, what this function does is it basically the first part, so the red part is trying to push one ball into the other.
Sure.
So it's trying to put the C ball into the D ball if you transform the C ball with R. And no, this is differentiable. This is differentiable. We just have this regularization here at the very end. This is very standard, and the margin. And the functions FE and RE, they are essentially just the embeddings. So they're just the lookup, or it's just a lookup on the embeddings.
Sure. Okay. So do you always guarantee you can find a solution by running gradient descent, or probably it's a local minimum, it's not a global, etc. How do you interpret your solution? I mean, why you think this solution is what you want if it's not a global solution?
Yeah. No, we are not guaranteed to find the solution. There are local minima, and so this is the question, and you're absolutely right, and this is the absolutely crucial question of completeness. Well, actually, it goes even beyond completeness, your question, because when we look at the soundness proof, if we reduced the loss to 0, then yes, we have found a model. Okay. What you are asking is if there is a model. So if this is a consistent theory, so if there is a model, can we actually find it such that the loss is 0? And the answer is no. Even if we can, in theory, find it, so even if there exists a solution in this space such that we do find, even if there exists such a model, we still don't know if we can find it, because then we have to look whether this function is convex. No, it's not. There are many problems to solve. You're absolutely right. It's the beginning of this completeness proof, but not the end.
Okay, so I have the second question of mine is, I know this this transformer, right? So initially it's used for natural language processing. It has this embedding module as well. Have you ever compared your method with that kind of a network? Do you understand my question? Like
with which kind of, but
like a transformer. You see, it's type of a neural network. Yeah, the first, I think the network takes input, and there is one module is something with similar to autoencoder, right? Try to embed this, do some dimensionality reduction, or embed your input to some space. Then from that space, do some prediction. It's kind of similar to what you have done here. So my question is, have you tried to compare your method with that type of state of the art? Yeah, that's my question.
So
it has been really popular recently, this type of network.
Yes,
especially for your natural language processing.
We are using transformers specifically for natural language processing. We are also using transformer-based models for embedding protein sequences in the space. So we are currently doing this where there's a model by Facebook. It's called ESM, which is Evolutionary Sequence Model, I think. It's to embed, it's a stack of transformers essentially applied to protein sequences. And we are testing this now. It improves the performance a lot, but this is more a way of embedding. So you can use this joint objective, but it's a way to embed background knowledge in language models. So you can see this as a way to take a language model, and we use it for protein sequences, but you can also take a language model and encode background knowledge about this domain in your language model. So it's something that is complementary, but to quickly, I think it's something that is complementary to a transformer. So you can use a transformer for this embedding, but to answer your direct question, we have not compared it with just the transformer, no.
Okay, yeah. So I think this is my question. Do you have any further questions from? Thanks, Robert, for the answer. And do we have any question from audience about his presentation?
Yeah, I have a small question.
Yes, please ask. Yeah.
Professor, you use random walk-based method to analyze the relationship between different proteins. I'd like to ask the advantage and disadvantage of the random walk-based method to analyze such relation compared with using the GCN-based method.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think they are quite similar because both of them, I mean, a random walk is a kind of, you can formulate this as message passing, just like message passing graph neural networks. So I don't think there are many differences. So you can use a GCN to generate similar types of embeddings for nodes and then use them in a similar way. The random walk is in some sense simpler, and you get somewhat different types of embeddings with word2vec. But I think these days, so this was 2017. So these days we would use graph neural networks or relational graph neural networks or relational GCNs or similar types of architectures instead of random walks.
Thank you. So you also have tried some GCN-based method on your task? Yes,
I did not talk about them now, but you can find them as part of MAUL. So there's a branch of MAUL or machine learning library which uses GCNs specifically. They do not give us, in our experiments, they do not give us many improvements, which is why they don't give us many improvements over just using these random walks directly, which is why I didn't talk much about them. And the key question that we have is how to formulate the message passing operations underlying some graph neural network architectures in such a way that we can at least encode some semantics. And it's an active research question. So I'd be happy, if you have some ideas, I'd be happy to discuss them.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, I think there is a question in the chat. So from Joe. Earlier, you discussed the probability for the use of this method in image processing. Are the methods you have discussed being actively extended outside of biology based tasks? Or was this just a toy example? Yeah, so you, okay.
Yes, very, very good question. Yes, they are actively used for zero-shot learning on images, zero-shot learning and embedding structured knowledge in natural language or general language models, but not by us. So we use them primarily for bioinformatics applications, but there is a group in Oxford, there's a group in Manchester. They have used it in a couple of different applications. In particular, our EL embedding model. So this EL embedding model is quite nice because you can geometrically reason within the embedding space or perform some limited form of reasoning. So yes, it's used by other people and other groups, not only in the UK, for zero-shot learning and for constraints. And I can send you the papers if you can send me a message. But you can look up some of the papers which cite this EL embedding work, and you'll find maybe 5 or 10 different papers which use EL embeddings for zero-shot learning, including images.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Do we have any further questions from audience? Okay. Yeah. If there is no further questions, I would like to thank the speaker again and for the very interesting talk. And see you guys next time. Yeah, Robert, if you can stay here for a little bit longer, so we probably can have a quick chat after.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks. Very interesting talk. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. Okay, good.